In this video, we're going to look at script parameters in PowerShell Universal. PowerShell supports lots of different types of parameter options, and PowerShell Universal exposes them in various ways. We're going to look at how to set parameter types, define mandatory parameters, specify parameter help, and even look at things like dynamic parameters. In this first section, we're going to look at the basics of PowerShell script parameters inside PowerShell Universal. So I'm going to create a new script, and I'm going to call this parameters, and then I'll click OK. This creates a parameters.ps1 script, and I can click Edit Code. Just like in PowerShell, parameters are defined by the param block inside PowerShell Universal scripts. Since they're just PowerShell scripts, we could do the same thing. So I'm going to specify param. I'm going to specify a string parameter. And as you can see here, when I click Run Script, now I have a parameters tab inside my Run Script dialog that has my script parameter. If I were to output that string in my script, you can see that the script analyzer warning goes away. And if we click Run Script, enter a value like hello, click Run, it's going to take us over to the job output page, and you're going to see hello is written to the output of the script because the value was passed into the script from our run dialog. If we go back to our parameter script now, we can also do things to augment what PowerShell Universal will do with the parameters, and they're just standard PowerShell things like the parameter attribute. So now, if I were to do something like set this to mandatory, specify a help message, like a string, and then save this, what you'll see when I click the Run Script button now is that it is now a mandatory field. You can tell by the little red asterisk over here, and then we have some help message text underneath the string, and then it works just the same as it did before. Specify hello. And now you can see that it output our text again. And one other thing you notice on the jobs page is we also have a parameters tab here, and if you click that, you'll actually see the value of the parameters that have passed into this script. So this is kind of helpful for auditing what's happening inside your scripts. You can see exactly what parameters were passed in and what value was defined. So let's go back to our parameters.ps1, and I'm just going to define one more parameter. In this case, I'm actually going to define a bool parameter, and we'll just call it isOK. IsOK now has that bool parameter type, and if we save that, what you're going to see in the Run Script dialog is that it is now a checkbox. So PowerShell Universal actually looks at the type value that you have for your parameters and will generate a different control for that type inside the Run Script dialog as well as the scheduling dialog. So in this next section, we're actually going to look at the different types of parameters that you can specify for your PowerShell Universal scripts. Now that we've looked at some of the basics of PowerShell Universal script parameters, let's take a look at some of the type values that you can specify for your parameter types. So I've defined a param block here that has a bunch of different param types. I have a string, I have a string array, I have a date time, I have a bool, I have a switch parameter, I have a string parameter with a validate set, I have a day of week enumeration, so this is an enum value, I have an integer, and then I have a secure string. So you could call this in standard PowerShell and pass in these different types. PowerShell will do some kind of transformation on some of these things, such as taking a string and converting it into a date time, and validating things like the validate set to ensure that you're setting one of those values. PowerShell Universal also looks at these and ensures that the correct value types are being passed into the param block. One other thing you're going to notice is that we have some default values set. We have a static value for this string here where the default value is just a string, and that's what we want to show up in the UI for that default value. That said, we also have a dynamic value. And this is dynamic because it's actually going out and calling a command like getDate to get the current date and time and set that as the default value for that date time. So if I click the Run Script dialog now, you're going to see what that behavior looks like. So you can see that we have the different types of components are created, and I'll kind of step through what each one of these kind of behaves like. But you'll also notice right away that we have some default values. The string is set to the default value of the string default, and then the date time actually got the current date and time and stored that as the default for that date time. So a string behaves just like you would expect. It's a text box. We saw this earlier. I can just type into it. A string array is actually what is considered kind of like a tags mode select box. So if I were to type something like test123 and hit enter, it's going to add that into the string array. If I want to add a second thing, item number 2, type 2, hit enter, and now I have another item in my string array. In terms of the date time, once you click on this, you can type in it, but you also have this date picker. So if you wanted to move to now or select a date in the future, something like that, you can do so with the date picker. Switch and bool types behave the same. They're just checkboxes. So if you have a switch parameter and you want that to be true, just check that switch parameter checkbox and it will pass that in. So while validate set was a string parameter, it actually had the validate set of options that you can select from. So we had 1, 2, 3 defined for that validate set attribute. And because of that, PowerShell Universal won't render a text box. It'll actually render a select box where you can select from one of those values. Similarly, if you have an enum value like day of the week in your parameter set, you'll see that it looks at the enumeration, gets all the values of that enumeration, and then renders a select box for you to select from those values without having to type them in manually. Integers are just a simple up-down numeric picker. So similar to what you see in the web, you can just go up and down, and it'll ensure that you can't type non-numeric characters into that particular dialog. And then finally, we have a secure string dialog, and when you use a secure string, what it actually does is it's a password dialog. So it masks the field so you can type secure values, and it will actually pass that in as a secure string object into your scripts. So in this section, we kind of looked at the different types of basic parameters inside PowerShell Universal. In the next section, we're going to look at a couple advanced types that have a little more in play and aren't necessarily tied in the same way that they are in standard PowerShell. Now that we looked at some of the basic types that you can specify for your parameters, I want to show off a couple of the advanced types that are available in PowerShell Universal. The first is a PS credential. So a PS credential is a username and password that you pass into your scripts. Typically, you don't want to hard code these things into our scripts, and that's why we treat them a little bit differently inside PowerShell Universal. So rather than displaying a username and password entry field, what we do is actually display a drop-down that lets you select from predefined credentials inside PowerShell Universal. You'll notice here that this credential object, the graph credentials, is actually something that has been defined elsewhere in the product. So if you're wondering where that is if you go to Platform, Variables, and you're going to see here that I have a couple different variables defined in my environment, and one of those being the graph credentials. So anything with a PS credential object type will provide that value to your scripts, and then you can select it and use it in your scripts. And where this is stored is actually in the secret store. So rather than storing it kind of plain text in the database, in this case it's storing it in the database vault, and it is encrypted. We also support other types of vault like Azure Key Vault, so you can actually retrieve those credentials outside of Key Vault and pass them into your scripts without ever having to store them directly in your scripts. So the other type of advanced parameter that we have here that you may have noticed is the file parameter. So this file type itself is actually a custom type inside PowerShell Universal, so this script won't run outside PowerShell Universal because it won't know what that file type is. And one of the reasons for that is that if you're running a script locally inside a PowerShell .exe process or pwsh.exe.process, passing in a file typically is something like a file path or something. But PowerShell Universal runs in a web service, and we need a way to upload files to the PowerShell Universal service from your local environment. So when you specify the file parameter type, what it's going to do is actually create an upload button for your file. Now, if I were to click this file upload box, what it's going to do is it's actually going to open a file selection dialog in Windows or whatever operating system you're using. And from there, I can select my file. So I'm going to select the PowerShell Universal logo, click OK, and you can see that it uploaded the file. It's actually stored it in the database. So when this goes to run on one of the PowerShell Universal job agents, it will download that file and have it local for that to run. And then it'll pass it in as a parameter that you can use inside your scripts. So now if I click Run, what you're going to see is that we actually have the output from that file inside PowerShell Universal here. And you'll notice that this content parameter has some numbers, and that's because the content parameter is actually a array of bytes. So you can take that array of bytes and either transform it into something directly in memory without having to do that manually yourself, or you can save it to disk, process it that way, that kind of thing. So this provides a way to kind of process things like CSVs and that kind of stuff directly inside your PowerShell Universal jobs without having to do anything too complicated. Let's look at another feature of PowerShell that PowerShell Universal uses for parameters, and that is parameter sets. So parameter sets allow you to define parameters that are mutually exclusive of each other. For example, if you had a commandlet that only accepted a username and password for one parameter set and an access token for another parameter set, you would never use those two together, so you kind of designate them as two different parameter sets. PowerShell itself will throw an error that it doesn't know how to use this commandlet if you specify both of them, or if you don't specify enough parameters to determine which parameter set to use. So you're going to see a couple things in this script. One being that we're using the commandlet binding attribute on top of our param block here, and we're specifying a default parameter set. This is so that we can kind of define what is the default if no parameter set can be determined based on the parameters that are defined. Because I'm not using mandatory parameters, that would actually be a problem here, but it's just kind of a way to better control which parameter set is being used. Next, you'll see that I have three parameters. Two of my parameters have the parameter attribute, one being in parameter set 1, which is one of our sets, and then the other one being in parameter set 2, and set 2 is our default parameter set. And finally, we have this parameter param3 that is not in any one of those parameter sets, which means that it's in the default parameter set, which means it is applied to all parameter sets. So it's available in all parameter sets because it does not define a specific one that it's in. So the behavior here is similar to what you would expect. You click Run Script, and we're going to have some parameters. And when you have multiple parameter sets that aren't the default parameter set, you actually get a parameter set dropdown at the top of the parameters dialog here. So as you can see, set 2 is selected by default because that's our default parameter set, and param2 and param3 are displayed. Param2 is part of set 2, and param3 is part of all parameter sets, so that's why they both show up. Param1 is not part of set 2, so it doesn't. If you were to select set 1 now, you can see that the parameters change. Param3 is now displayed, and param1 is now displayed because they're both part of the set 1 parameter set. Finally, we're going to look at PowerShell dynamic parameters and how PowerShell Universal uses those. Dynamic parameters are kind of an advanced topic, and typically you will not have to use dynamic parameters, but in certain cases it's nice to be able to load parameters dynamically and kind of display some UI based on that. So in this example, I actually have a param block that has a single parameter with validate set that allows me to select 1, 2, or 3. Below that, I have a dynamic param block here, and inside this dynamic param block, I pretty much use a script block to define the logic that's going to run when PowerShell Universal or the PowerShell SDK is attempting to locate additional parameters for this script. So as you can see here, I have an if statement that checks the validate set value. So once that validate set value changes, it's going to run this dynamic param block to determine whether or not we need additional parameters added to this script. So if validate set is equal to 1, we're going to create a new parameter attribute. So this is actually kind of defining the parameters at runtime rather than defining them in the param block. So just like you could have a parameter attribute up here, we're going to define a parameter attribute, but create it with new object. From there, I'm going to set it to mandatory and add it to a new collection of attributes, since we can have multiple attributes on a parameter. Next, I'm going to define a runtime define parameter. This is going to be called another one. It's going to be a string, and it's going to use that attribute collection that I put together above this new object call. Finally, we're going to pass that into a dictionary of runtime parameters. So this dictionary can include one or more runtime parameters, and you can kind of change your logic based on what's happening inside your script. So in PowerShell Universal, what happens is if you click this Run Script dialog, you're going to see that we only have the single validate set shown here. If I were to do something like select 2, you're going to see nothing shows up because inside my dynamic param block, I'm not actually checking for 2, I'm checking for 1. So now if I select 1, you're going to see that now I get a dynamic parameter. In this case, another one shows up. You can see that I have the little star because it's mandatory. And from here, I can actually go ahead and enter that value, and it will be passed into my PowerShell script, which I then can use to execute whatever I need to. So this kind of allows you to create like a cascading form. Depending on different selections inside your form, you can adjust the form based on what changes.